Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, former state representative from southern Minnesota, and as usual, we are joined by State Representative Walter Hudson of District 30A. Walter, I want to kick off the show to talk about a really boring topic called bonding that is greatly misunderstood, and it becomes a topic of discussion every year at the legislature. They call it the infrastructure bill, the jobs bill sometimes. And I call it the debt bill because I want to explain to people my perspective of bonding. Bonding is the process of borrowing money, bonding the state's taxpayers to pay for something. Bonding has a role when the state has a tough deficit. We need to pay for things, maintain our state infrastructure, roads, bridges, state-owned buildings. That is a core function of government. And unfortunately, the bonding bill becomes a collection of pet projects and earmarks where in order to pass a bonding bill, you need not just a majority, but a supermajority of the legislators to vote for it. And so they go around with what they call discretionary money in the bill, sometimes $50 or $100 million, and literally buy votes, asking members what they would like the taxpayers of the state to pay for in their district. And I want to be clear, roads and bridges, wastewater infrastructure, drinking water, this is all very important for our state. But each project, each road is analyzed for surface degradation. They understand what roads are the most important, what's heavily traveled, what's an essential need, and what roads need maintenance. And this long funding formula determines which roads should be funded first. And that money gets you put money in a bucket, those roads should be done in that order. Earmarks happen when they want the legislator to vote for a bill, they'll say, well, I'll vote for the bill, but I want Highway 63 to be finished in my district. And then that gets an earmark placed in the bill that gets put above every other road and bridge project and funded in that order. And you start, having all these earmarks added to the bill, all these pet projects, museums, and other infrastructure that's not essential to our state. I represented 22 towns here in my district. Some towns have an indoor swimming pool. Some have an old swimming pool that's outdoors. Why should the taxpayers of one district be paying for an indoor swimming pool in a different district or an air conditioner for that district? That's a lot of stuff, questions that come up. But this bonding bill became ugly. The Democrats are in charge. They need Republicans to vote for the bill. So this is a leverage Republicans have saying, we're not going to pass this bonding bill unless you do this, and get tax cuts and, all the stuff we should be asking for. Why on earth did this bill pass yesterday with Republican support, including my state rep, Bjorn Olson, who was out, bragging in the media about bringing home all this money to the district and spending billions of dollars? I mean, what went on, and what's your view of bonding as far as the state's role in it? Should it have passed? Should we pay cash for everything as opposed to putting the state further in debt?
Well, I wish there was a really simple, concise, and principled way to answer that question. I don't know that there is. I voted against it. I voted against both the bonding bill and the cash capital infrastructure bill. I had my own reasons. Happy to go into those. But this was the first vote that I have taken since getting up here that I really struggled with, because it is a complex issue that with a lot of context, so much context. And I think for a lot of folks here who voted green on it in our caucus, the context was personal. It's like their community needs critical infrastructure. They told their voters they were going to get this project done for them. Like that was one of their campaign promises. That could be part of the context. The election is a huge piece of context that needs to be taken into consideration. The Democrats won. They control it. They control the whole kit caboodle. They got the trifecta. Now you can say, and the case has been made, and I don't know what the answer to this question is. The case has been made that this thing is leverage, like you say, right? That if you hold off on the bonding bill, You can use that to dangle over the majority's head and say, we're not going to give you bonding until you give us a Social Security tax cut repeal, or until you give us a hearing on this bill or that bill. And yeah, you can make that play. You certainly can. What you can't do is unelect the Democrat majority. And I think that the goalpost of let's hold off on bonding until we get X is a goalpost that is very easily moved. And the Democrats know that, right? So they know that if they capitulate on a Social Security tax cut, that there's going to be somebody in the caucus is going to think to ask for more, right? They're going to think to ask for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And it's kind of like how much do you want to give up that negotiating power? And so you got to think about it from the perspective of the Democrats as well as the Republicans. And I have heard people whose judgment I trust on both sides of that question of the utility of utilizing bonding as leverage make their case. And I'm not going to share their arguments. But I don't know. I don't know if it's useful or not. I don't know if you can get stuff by holding out on a bonding bill or not. To me, that ultimately wasn't the consideration that affected my vote. There were two considerations that affected my vote. By the way, just for full disclosure, I've got a project in this bonding bill that passed. Okay. And to speak to the philosophy of bonding, I think you explained it very well. The project that I have in the bonding bill that passed, even though I voted against the bill, is a $5 million bonding for a wastewater treatment plant in the city of St. Michael, which is smack dab in the middle of my district. This is a project that has been initiated years ago, and with the expectation that the bonding was going to occur for it at the very least last year. And of course, which by the way, last year was a bonding year. So you hear a lot of people talk about how, oh, it's not a bonding year. Well, last year was, and they didn't pass a bonding bill. And there are a lot of projects, including the one in St. Michael, that ended up being placed into various degrees of critical status by virtue of the fact that they don't have the funding they need in order to go forward. And so again, context, that's another thing you need to take into consideration. But just viewed on its own merits, like let's say we were doing single subject bill, as everybody likes to talk about, and we were just voting on my project in St. Michael as its own bill, which it was. I authored it. It was one bill. The case I would make on the House floor and in committee, if I had to make the case for why this is appropriate for the state to bond in order to provide for a wastewater treatment plant, is the price tag. It's a $5 million facility. That is the annual budget of my city, the neighboring city to St. Michael, Albertville, right? So it's kind of like if you were considering buying a house or a vacation home or a really expensive car, or sending your kid to school and you don't have the cash on hand. When there's a certain cost to income ratio, so to speak, that makes borrowing rational. And that's what the bonding bill is supposed to be for. That's what bonding conceptually is supposed to be for. The problem, as you highlight, is that we don't go through project by project and judge it on the merits. It all gets lumped together in the bonding bill, capital investment bill. And in this case, it got separated out into what they call general obligation bonds and cash, things that we are not borrowing money for, but just paying straight up. And you get all these other projects too. So you've got this long list of wastewater treatment plants and, roads and bridges, whatever the case may be, of projects that legitimately should be funded. And then you've got a bunch of rinky-dink Mickey Mouse stuff that really should not be paid for by the general taxpayer. One of the arguments that was made on the House floor, I think it was actually made by Kurt Dowd of all people, on when we were debating this on Monday night, was he pointed to a public safety facility in Edina that is going to be bonded for as a result of this bill. And the case he made was, why are taxpayers in my district paying for what should be a local function of government? I mean, that's law enforcement, providing for your police department. Like in Albertville, we don't have a police department. You know why? Because we can't afford it. We contract with the sheriff. So why is Edina getting a police department, a structure for police, and we have to keep paying out of our property taxes to contract with Wright County, right? So there are totally legitimate arguments for why the process sucks. As is so often the case in our political institutions, people end up stuck between a rock and a hard place, because it's do you make the point against the thing or the process that you think is misaligned with principle or out of order or whatever the case may be? Do you make that point at the expense of yourself and your community and something that is needed in your city, in your district? And I'll be real honest. I'll be real honest with you. If there had been, because we needed 11 Republican votes in order to pass this bonding bill. If the board had gone up and there had been 10 Republican votes, and I knew that that bill was going to fail, I would have had a real hard time not switching my vote to green, because I know what that wastewater treatment plant means to the city of St. Michael, which is real people who I actually know, who I go to church in St. Michael. Okay. So it's personal and it's real and it's meaningful. And that's true of every representative on both sides of the aisle who voted for various projects. The reason why I voted no, and the reason why I would have struggled really hard to maintain my no in that circumstance where my vote would have been the deciding vote, is a couple of reasons. Number one, we have a $17.5 billion surplus. We can afford to pay for this stuff, right? Like the bonding bill was roughly $1.52 billion, something in that area. I mean, it doesn't even put a dent into the surplus to just pay cash for all of this stuff. We absolutely positively could have done that. And we absolutely positively should have done that, short of dividing the surplus up and just mailing it back to everybody who paid it. The next best thing you could do, in my view, is use it to offset future interest payments by paying cash for projects today. Totally makes sense. And if Republicans were in charge, that's probably what we would do. But we're not.
Okay. Well, so, I want to cut you off there, because about 3 or 4 years ago, we had an enormous surplus, not as big as this one, but the House passed a $800 million bonding bill under Republican control. We controlled the House and Senate. Then it went to the Senate for negotiation, and it came back twice the size, $1.6 billion borrowing bill, when we had an enormous surplus. Republicans were in charge. And to explain the bonding bill, you're basically creating a credit card, right? You're getting a line of credit, and every year for the next 10 or 20 years, we have to make our minimum payments on that credit card. Well, if you take all the minimum payments for previous bonding bills and you add them together, at the time this bill passed 3 years ago or whatever, it was $1.6 billion in interest payments on previous bonding bills. And here we are putting another $1.6 billion bonding bill, another credit card out there. It made no financial sense. The bill last night that passed, it was going to cost $300 million in interest to be paid. And it's not just the interest that drives up the price of things. Your wastewater infrastructure bill, your bill for your district, isn't just about, the people in your district aren't at risk of not being able to flush the toilet. We have places in the state where they are. The reason why your wastewater infrastructure is required is because new state regulations put stricter prohibitions on the discharge of phosphates, where your community built a brand new system not too long ago that discharges into a pond, and now it requires it to discharge it in a river or something like that. And so this is about government regulations. It's causing you to do this. I would push back on regulations. But for the other things in the bill, there are some projects that are good, transportation, whatever, but we should be paying cash. When you bond, it then requires that every project being funded by state dollars through a bonding bill have to get prevailing wage. All these things jack up the price. It's not just the $300 million. It's probably an extra $1 billion in costs that that wouldn't need to be paid if they were to be done locally. And you said in the city council, it drives bad behavior when, you know what, if we're just negligent with our money, we can force taxpayers of neighboring communities to pay for our project, right? I've got, cities in my district that are really well managed, and they were paying for all their wastewater maintenance and everything else. Some communities didn't do that, and now they're forcing all taxpayers to pay for it. So it drives bad behavior at the local government level when we continue to bond for things like fire halls and police stations, where every community is responsible for paying, for that portion of it. Granted, there are some things of public health like wastewater, drinking water, that if they get in a predicament where they can't pay for it, the state can step in through this funding formula, but it shouldn't be earmarked by legislators. The funding formula is bipartisan. It's agreed on. It can be altered if needed, but these bills just get just absolutely out of hand. This is the first bill that passed that I didn't see any tax cuts or healthcare junk in there. Like, it's actually a bonding bill, but it is bonding for multiple different things. It was sad to see. You put out a tweet that was praising Garofalo and Kurt Dowd, okay, saying that these two people are fighting for the taxpayers of the state. And I have to push back a little bit because, I like Pat. He's brilliant. But Pat Garofalo and Kurt Dowd, of more than anything else, are hyper political individuals. Okay, we can debate their conservative credentials, but they are brilliant political strategists. And when they're in the minority, they will appear to fight like hell for conservative causes. When we're in the majority, government grows under their leadership. And we've seen that. Of all the scorecards out there, LEA, CPAC, Action for Liberty has one. Action for Liberty scorecard started giving awards for the biggest fake conservative. When you flip from the majority to the minority, everybody's votes change, right? It's easy to vote no on stuff, but when you're in the majority, it's when it's the most difficult to continue to advocate for conservative causes. But your tweet got some pushback from conservatives who were, upset and concerned about you. Like, what's going on with Walter? Is he sliding into the swamp? But I wanted to give you a chance to defend yourself.
Well, if you were concerned about that tweet, just wait for the video that I'm going to cut together and put out sometime later this week, and that'll make you even more concerned. Look, let me start here to just kind of like establish the tone. When I went to my endorsing convention, I was by no means a sure thing. I had a very strong challenge from another gentleman who was interested in being the state representative from District 30A. I ended up prevailing 80-20. And the reason why was because I got up in front of them and I told them, I'm going, and the way I phrased it was, I had this whole preamble talking about how darkness is cast aside by light, and that it's our responsibility to cast that light. And the way we do that is simply by speaking the truth. And that's what I was going to do. I was going to come down here and I was going to say what is true and let the chips fall where they may. And then when I went to the BPO convention about a month ago or so here in Wright County, I came at them again and I gave them the other side of that coin, which was, I said to them, I told you in the endorsing convention that I was going to come down to St. Paul and I was going to tell you the truth. Now, here's the other side of that. I meant it. Like, I actually meant that I was going to say what's true. And the thing about saying things that's true, and we all know this in the context of our own relationships, our own families, talking to our kids, talking to our parents, talking to our spouses, the truth is not always comfortable. The truth is not always received well. And we don't just need to say what's true to our enemies and to our opponents and to our adversaries. We also need to be able to have tough conversations and say what's true to our brothers and our sisters and our friends and our family. And so that's the tone here. I call things as I see them. And I wasn't here when Kurt Dowd was in charge. This is my first session. I've been here 2 months. I'm working with the lived experience that I have on a day-to-day basis here at the Capitol. Is Kurt a shrewd political operator? No doubt. No doubt about it. Does he have motives that I don't know about that cause him to to argue this way or that in ways that conservatives would like or not like. Maybe. I have no idea. It also, I think, in the context of the moment, doesn't matter. What matters in the moment is who is standing up and making the case, saying, this is what's true, this is what's right, this is what we should do. And what has fascinated me, and it's not been just in this instance, but most prominently, I think, in this instance with the bonding bill, is that Kurt Doubt in particular has been the person making the case against bonding. Other people have, but he has been like the standard bearer of why this is not just a bad idea, but a stupid idea, a wrong idea, a crazy idea, as Ann New would say, a bonkers idea. And he's made his case extraordinarily well. He's made it at the level that I would expect from a Jeremy Munson or from a Eric Mortensen, right? Like in terms of like the content of what he has had to say. And there's nothing about how he says it or the context in which he says it, other than being in the minority, as you point out, that suggests to me that he's being insincere. In fact, this has been a really weird moment because up until now, we've been able to keep the team together pretty well, and not have public squabbles about which way we should go, this way or that. But on this one, clearly, by virtue of the dots on the board being green or red, we had a split. And there were people who got up on the House floor that argued very passionately against bonding, and there were people that got up on the House floor and argued very passionately for bonding. And that does not typically happen. Usually the party has a message, and they stay on message, and they stick together. I think that speaks to the complexity, as I said earlier, of the context in which people were making their decisions. And the bottom line is, if you hate bonding and you were looking for somebody to make your case, that person on the House floor, and by the way, I mean, we're not supposed to talk about what happens in caucus, but in caucus, okay, that person was Kurt Doubt. Number two to him was Pat Garofalo in terms of coming out and making the statements and making the case why this was, and with him, it was, you saw it in committees as well, of why are we doing this? This is insane. We should just be spending cash. And so I got to call it the way I see it. Now, let's say we get in the majority in 2024, God willing, and these guys flip the script and all of a sudden they're arguing the other way. Well, I've got a memory that's longer than 2 years. So I'll tell you the truth then too. I'll be like, yeah, this is weird. I don't know why they're saying this now when they said something totally different 2 years ago. And then we can have that conversation. But in this moment, I'm just telling you what I'm seeing.
Okay. Well, I'll leave it at that. I think that, sitting on the House floor, having served in the majority and then in the minority, and watching the then minority leader, Kurt Doubt, get up and complain about all these tactics that are doing, and you're not letting us speak. And it's like, this is the guy that had the mute button installed at the speaker's rostrum so he could shut off debate, but you'll see the hypocrisy come around. And I hope that we are in the majority when you're serving here, probably next session. Speaking of tactics and complaints about not being heard, I want to play a clip for the listeners of Representative Duane Quam complaining in committee when he wasn't getting his questions answered on a bill. So just to cue it up, he's sitting in committee. They're debating a bill, and as you know, the Democrats bring a bill forward. They handpick their testifiers to come forward. The chairs of all the committees are Democrats. They choose the committee testifiers, and they choose which people get to submit questions to the testifiers. And then, as you well know, they leave just a small amount of real debate until the end, when they're up against time that they have to dismiss. And Duane Quam expresses his frustration here.
Sure. I will ask Representative Frederick, and Representative Quam, I will ask the Secretary of State's office to provide us with a checklist of the checks and balances, and I will make sure it gets provided to committee members.
But there's more than the checks and balances.
Representative Quam,
then haul me out of the committee if you're not going to allow us to actually debate the darn bill.
Representative Altendorf, you have a question.
Mr. Chair, you need to let us.
Representative Quam, stop it.
No, I will not allow you to ignore valid questions.
Representative,
I didn't even get the answer to my first question. You said, oh, no follow-ups. You need to actually cover the bill.
Representative Quam,
You
are out of
didn't
order.
talk about all of the things that we got with observers and challengers. You have not talked about the fact that you don't have the balance between the two parties and election judges. You have a lot of stuff that's not explained, and this is not a trivial change. And if you don't care about the quality of the bills that you include, then you really, really are not doing the service to the citizens of the state of Minnesota. And I will not sit here to a travesty of pushing through stuff that there's not the details, the author can't answer questions, and you obfuscate and don't allow us to actually cover it.
Motives, you are creating a...
No, I am pointing out the obvious.
Okay.
I am pointing out the obvious.
The motion was to lay the bill over. So Representative Frederick has renewed the motion that House File 550
Sure,
as amended
cut off
laid over for
questions,
possible-
ignore valid
The bill
concerns,
is laid over.
and you just have a...
Okay, I'm going to turn over the chair to Vice Chair Greenman. Good luck with this one, Representative Greenman.
What are your thoughts, Walter?
Look, Duane is expressing the frustration that we all feel. I felt the exact same frustration the day before yesterday in the Children and Families Committee when we're hearing a bill by Chair Pinto to establish a brand new state department, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. We're going to have a Department of Your Family now in the state of Minnesota. And they left us with 5 minutes at the end of the committee for member discussion. Because, you got to fit in all your agency testifiers, everybody popping up to talk about how wonderful this is. And it's been a long time coming, and I'm so glad we're doing it. But the people who are actually elected, who actually represent Minnesotans, who actually represent the people, though, we get 5 minutes. Now, in fairness, they did hold us over for about 15 minutes. So we got to talk about it a little bit longer. But the problem with that is that there's a committee that wasn't communicated, right? So there's a committee structure. As a member sitting in committee, that there's a structure, that the committee ends at a certain time. And so in your head, as a member, you're making your case. If you have something to say, you're making your case, maybe writing a little outline down of the types of things you want to say. And then as the clock ticks down, you have to adjust. You have to be like, well, I can't go into that because I'm not going to have time. And you're also taking into consideration the fact that you're one of, however many people, 17, however many people who have election certificates who are sitting around the room. And so you don't want to sit there and monopolize the time either. At least I don't. I try to be considerate. And so, I was the first one to speak when they went to member discussion, and I said something about it. I'm like, I don't know how I'm supposed to address the substance of this bill when we got 5 minutes left. And then the chair who was sitting in was like, well, we're going to stay a little bit longer, Representative. Okay, well, I don't know how long. Is it going to be 5 minutes? Is it going to be 10? Is it going to be an hour? And so that calculation in my head of how much time I have or how much time I should take to make whatever case. So it's things like that where they are trying to, and by the way, that bill, a bill to establish a new state department, was one of 4 freaking bills that were being heard in that committee that day. And that's what I'm saying is it's like, if you're going to have extraordinarily impactful legislation, like the elections bill, which I think is what Quam is talking about, or the blackout bill, or the creation of a grand new state department, right? Then maybe give that its own committee, right? Like maybe give us the time to actually unpack and vet and deal with the broad, far-reaching implications. Don't just present me with like a pageant of testifiers to tell me about how wonderful your idea is, and then give me 5 minutes at the end to ask a question or lodge an objection, and then pretend as though that's deliberation in a public process. It's not. And so while Quam certainly, pushed the boundaries of what's considered acceptable decorum in a House committee hearing, it's understand this is day, 30, 31, 32. Every single one of us has been dealing with that frustration for a month's worth of days. And it's understandable that one of us would pop their top after all that.
Yeah, and for those listening, why this matters. We know that Democrats are steamrolling or log rolling the minority here in the legislature, but why it matters is because you are supposed to debate and improve the bills as they hit committee. And when you're sitting on the House floor and you have a bill that comes to the floor for a vote, and it's been through 3 or 4 or 10 committee stops, your expectation is that that bill has been improved and that people that sit on those committees that know most about that area of policy have actually improved it and passed it. And so by the time it gets to the floor, you can bring forward arguments, but the understanding is it's been improved, especially when there's conflict with existing law or when there's budgeting issues and we don't know how we're going to pay for it. That should all be worked out before it gets to the floor. And instead, the bills just get ramrodded through without serious debate. They're heard, but they're not debated or improved. And certainly very few amendments are being accepted by the minority. And what most people see as the biggest frustration when they come to committee, they hear a bill that's going to be impactful like yours. They might bring signs and wear T-shirts in support or against it. And in the end, it may not even get a vote. It just gets laid over for possible inclusion in the committee's omnibus bill. So they're hearing it, but there's not even a vote. And that can be frustrating for so many people involved in watching the policy go through. So this is why it's important. They're not, if you're listening, they are not debating and improving bills here at the legislature. It's just getting crammed through.
Yeah, no doubt. And like I say, the idea that the minority members on the Committee of Children and Families debating a bill about creating a Department of Children, Youth, and Families, the idea that we get 5 minutes to talk about it is just insane. It's absolutely nuts. You can't, and because they often argue, because you talk about the fact that there's different jurisdictions for the committees, and a lot of times, especially under the current majority, the chair of whatever committee will say that they're going to limit discussion to the relevant provisions of a particular bill that are relevant to the jurisdiction of that committee. Well, in this case, the entire bill, it's a bill to create a Department of Children and Families, and this is the Committee of Children and Families. Okay, you've got I don't know how many pages this is, but you got a few dozen pages in front of me of an incredibly impactful piece of legislation, and you're giving all of us there were less minutes left on the clock than there were minority members sitting at the desk. Okay, that's frustrating. That's frustrating. And then, like I say, even though they gave us the courtesy of holding us over, it's not even really a courtesy, because people have schedules. They have other places to be, constituent meetings and such. And as I said earlier, we're operating in good faith on the assumption that we're going to get to have the discussion within the time constraints that have been provided, and we're not able to, and that is entirely because of the way that the committees are being run. Yep. It's something that I don't know. It's very frustrating, and I understand why Duane did what he did.
Yeah. Thank you, Duane, for speaking out. When I first was in the legislature, I was on the Health and Human Services Policy Committee, and then the next year I was on the Health and Human Services Finance Committee, because it was really, when I was on the policy side, I kept asking about how these things are being funded, and and they're like, well, that's for the Finance Committee. We're the Policy Committee, and then you get on the Finance Committee, and then you question the bill that comes before you, and the answer is, well, that's on the policy side, right? They always try to shield it and say, well, they're going to settle that in commerce, but it does the same thing. It gets ramrodded through that committee too. And so you got to save your argument sometimes for the floor, in which that's why you're there for 6 hours debating an important bill.
Yes, and that point cannot be overstated, and thank you for making it. Is that I'm gonna use the word, they bitch and complain about how much time we spend debating things on the House floor and how many people get up to speak. It is the source of visible ire on their faces, and yet it's entirely their fault, because, as you say, all of these issues and concerns could have been vetted and voiced and worked through in committee if we were allowed to do it, but they don't allow us to do it. And so we end up having 15 to 20 frickin' amendments on a massively impactful piece of legislation. And you're right, we end up staying there until midnight. Look, I would rather be home with my family. You know, I'd rather be doing any other thing than sitting and debating a terrible bill that should never have come before us in the first place. But I got elected, and I'm under the obligation to make the case when I have the opportunity to make it. And you have left me with one opportunity, and that's third reading on the House floor.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I want to bring up is Zach Stephenson's press conference yesterday. Look, we got an issue in the Twin Cities with rampant car theft, right? There's carjackings. There's also, cars being stolen out of people's garages, driveways, parking lots, everywhere. And he had a press conference yesterday to address the issue of car theft. But instead of blaming car thieves for car thefts, he blames car manufacturers for making cars that are creating a danger to our community because they're too easy to steal.
What we have right now is a situation where an automaker has produced a motor vehicle that simply is not safe to have in our community right now. You heard from the chief about the public safety impact that these vehicles are having. It's a tremendous cost, both financial and human, on our community. And the people responsible should be accountable and should step up to the plate and be the ones to bear the cost of fixing the problem. And that's what the Senator Seeberger, Representative Tabke's bill does, is it ensures that it's the auto manufacturers, not the consumer, not the state, not the insurance companies, that have to foot the bill for the mistake that they created. It's unfortunate that they haven't already stepped up the plate to take care of it, but that's sometimes what happens. And so we have to take a strong action here at the legislature.
So there it is. There's the Democrat argument, the same argument being made on why they should be banning guns, because guns are violent. It's not the criminals, it's the guns' fault. And here it's the car's fault for being easily stolen. What gives?
Yeah, and it's really disingenuous because Representative Stephenson went on Twitter after that and went in a back and forth, tried to present this moderate case of, well, we want to hold both parties accountable. If a criminal steals a car, they should be held accountable. But big business needs to be held accountable as well. If they're creating a product that's deficient and that doesn't have that has a critical safety failure or safety feature, then they should be held accountable for that too. Now, setting aside the merits of his second point of holding manufacturers accountable for what he's regarding as a major security vulnerability, he's just not being honest with you about their desire to hold criminals accountable. And that is not an opinion, all right? I heard a bill last week in committee to cap, we talked about it on the program, I believe, to cap the amount of probation that we can have in the state of Minnesota to 5 years. All right. So there's two ways that we punish criminals. One is by imprisonment, incarceration. The second is by probation. So on the probation side of that equation, they want to cap it to 5 years. Okay, set that aside. Put it in your pocket for a second. Now consider this. They also are actively working, and I sit on the Public Safety Committee, so I see this stuff. They're actively working to both reduce sentences and provide for earlier and earlier release and more opportunities to both have your previous sentence reduced and to be released. There's a bill that made its way through committee in public safety that would have the effect, I might not be getting all the details exactly right, but basically what it was that if you have good behavior, however they define it, that every 2 years of good behavior, you get 1 year off your sentence. 1 year off. So you could potentially have somebody go in and end up getting out with half of the sentence that they were justly administered as a consequence for their crime because they're a good person now, we've decided. All right, so they're reducing sentences, they're providing for early release, they're capping probation, and that's not even the piece de la resistance. If you go and you look at from 2020 to 2022, the strategic outline document from the Department of Corrections, they have as one of their top level goals for the Democrat administered Department of Corrections, zero warehousing. What that means is the goal of the Department of Corrections is to get to the point where no one is incarcerated. So they're simply lying to you when they say they want to hold criminals accountable. They don't. They don't want to hold them accountable at all. In fact, you can go and you can watch. In fact, I've got some stuff up on my Twitter, back and forths I've had with a Majority Leader Jamie Long and other members on the Democrat side, where I have brought up this point of the administration of justice requires punishment. And you guys are taking the punitive aspect of criminal justice out of criminal justice, which means it's no longer justice because the victim was punished, right? Like, that's the whole point, is that if you violate the rights of someone else, you have forfeited your equivalent right. The scale needs to be balanced. That's why Lady Justice holds that scale. That's what it means. We're going to make things right. We're going to set things whole. That means punishment. It's required. And their goal is to not punish anybody. They want to take punishment out of the equation and replace it with rehabilitation. Now, look, I'm all for rehabilitation. I agree. We need to have, there do need to be reforms that take somebody who has served their time, who has endured their punishment that they justly must endure, and then rehabilitates them, gets them to the point. And these can be, they don't have to be like concurrent or however you would say it. They don't have to be like parallel, or they can be parallel. They don't have to be separate. So it's not like you punish, and then rehabilitate. You can have both punishment and rehabilitation side by side, but you damn well better have the punishment, because that's the whole point. The rehabilitation presumes that the punishment has occurred, right? And what they want to do is they just want to take the punishment part completely out of it and say, and when you do that, and when you listen, as I have to, and this is going back to Duane's frustration, is I have to sit in committee twice a week, and now it's going to be more often as we're getting towards these deadlines and whatnot in public safety, and listen to them talk about how we need to come alongside perpetrators. We need to provide them with wraparound services, that's the goal. And we're talking about incarcerated people, all right? We're talking about inmates that they're talking about, that we need to provide them with all these services to come alongside them and wrap around them and and give them a big old hug in prison. If punishment isn't part of the equation, then you should go out and commit crimes, right? I mean, you're going to get free room and lodging, you're going to get wraparound services, you're going to get job training, you're going to get education, you're going to get told you're special, you're going to get they're just offering value. If you take away the punishment, it's just a value add, right? There's no longer any reason not to commit a crime.
Yeah, I can't believe that the public is buying into this. I don't know where the Republican narrative is, other than enforce the laws that we have. Right? We have a law enforcement problem, a law enforcement shortage, and this is the way that you dissuade people from committing crimes, not by, as you say, the value proposition of allowing criminals to get away with it.
Right.
One of the other topics I want to talk about is weird post of Peggy Flanagan at an event with a T-shirt that I don't understand. It's a black T-shirt, and we'll put it up here for those who are watching the video. But for those listening to the podcast, it's a black T-shirt. It looks like some metal rock concert shirt, but it says "Protect Trans Kids," and it has a big dagger and in a horizontal rose on it. And I don't understand what this shirt means. I first saw it and thought it had to do with castration, in allowing trans kids to have castration, but maybe is this defending people to the death? I don't understand it. What's your take?
I have no idea what I'm looking at with that shirt. Yeah, the knife is extremely prominent, and in a context of saying protect trans kids, I can only assume that means you're willing to physically attack somebody with a knife and stab them if you perceive that they're a threat to a trans kid, which onto itself, if you wanted to be incredibly generous, incredibly generous, you might be able to justify, except for the fact that what they mean by protecting trans kids is just silencing anybody who disagrees to any degree with the LGBT agenda.
Yeah. I've worn some punchy T-shirts in my time, but she was, in fact, this week I think she was she had the full authority of the governor, because the governor was under surgery and gave her authority. I don't know if this was the day that she was governor for an hour or not, but it was highly inappropriate, especially when this topic of debating rights of the doctors to surgically alter, chemically castrate children is before the legislature. Thought it is extremely inappropriate. What other topics you got, Walter?
Well, I I got into it a little bit with the Democrats yesterday in public safety. Representative Cedric Frazier has a bill, and he threw me a little bit of a curveball. So the bill that we initially looked at was a bill to ban white supremacy from police officers, which sounds great, right? Of course, we don't want white supremacists to be police officers, but the devil's in the details, right? You dig into it and you realize this is something that is not balanced and well considered. Well, he had a delete all amendment that was not available to us when we were first considering this bill, and so I went off on this spiel about why specifically targeting white supremacy was not the way to go. And as it turns out, in his delete all, he eliminated the language regarding white supremacy. So that's good. I'm glad he did that. That's what I was going for. I think it makes his bill better. I still have a problem with some of the language that's in there because it explicitly calls out like political, religious, and ideological motivations for so-called hate groups. And I'm having conversations with him about that. But despite the legislative process confusion and what have you in committee, the point that I made is nonetheless stands, which is that the problem with targeting white supremacy from a public policy perspective in 2023 is that I don't know what the hell you're talking about, because people use that term to refer to just pretty much to refer to whatever they disagree with. It's become the new Nazi of if you just say that something is white supremacy, the emotional manipulation of getting somebody to back down or getting your side to get revved up and tilted against it precludes you from having to actually make an argument. And what I said in committee was, look, you guys are actually empowering white supremacy. And the way you're doing it is because, I have some degree of experience with dealing with and contending with and confronting white supremacy as the son of a black father and a white mother. All right. My actual physical existence is a rebuke of white supremacy. It is the antithesis of white supremacy. I am regarded, as are my children, as physical, literal abominations. That's the word they use when they talk about people like me, people with mixed heritage, such as myself. They call us abominations. All right. That's white supremacy. Somebody who says the white race is superior to every other race and non-white races should be, to one degree or another, subordinated to the white race. That's white supremacy. And that is evil, and that should be condemned, and that should be fought against. But it's harder to do that. It is harder to fight against actual, vile, evil white supremacy when you broaden the definition for political convenience to include things such as the list that the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture had back in 2020, just 3 years ago. They had this display up in Washington, D.C., that listed amongst the things that are considered whiteness, things such as critical thinking, objectivity, timeliness, future orientation, the nuclear family structure, okay, hard work, Protestant work ethic. These were all things that were listed as quote unquote whiteness in a context of talking about. So in other words, if that's your definition of being white, those qualities, which I regard those qualities as just being a normal, responsible, decent human being, but they're defining it as being white. Under that definition, if you claim that those qualities are superior to their antonyms, superior to the opposite, that timeliness is better than being loosey-goosey and showing up late and never fulfilling your obligations, you make that statement, you are a white supremacist, because you have just said that a quality of whiteness is better than its opposite. And when you do that, when you proceed with that type of loosey-goosey, emotionally manipulative, and intellectually dishonest definition of what white supremacy is, and then you pass a bill like Frazier's in its original form, where it says we're going to ban or fire any police officer who's associated with a group that promotes white supremacy. Well, now you've given some woke pink-haired administrator or post board member in this case the ability to go through and just check off every conservative, normal, decent Christian cop that they can find under some trumped up charges that they're a white supremacist.
Another bill of Frazier's that he introduced, it's a very short bill, has to do with racial impact screening. This is House File 2610. And this is basically saying anytime that the Sentencing Guidelines Commission wants to change the sentencing recommendations, that they have to create a racial impact screening or a racial impact statement a study to determine if their change in sentencing guidelines is going to impact people of a certain race more than white people, right? So this came about. I mean, in St. Paul, there was a complaint about how I had an apartment downtown St. Paul. You commute every day, but there's people smoking weed and doing drug deals on the corners and all this kind of stuff. And cops were standing there watching it, and people were complaining to the cops, "Why aren't you enforcing this?" As well, the prosecutor kicks out these charges because they think that too many black people are being convicted of drug deals, and that there's a racial impact, and so they're not prosecuting them. This bill is basically going to do more of that. It's going to say, look, anytime we have a new law or a new sentencing guideline, is it going to cause the population in prison to be more black than white? And if it does, then it may not pass or it may not be allowed.
Right. And again, context is key here, right? So what you just described strikes me as reverse racial profiling, because what those police officers were doing was they saw the behavior. And if it was a white person doing it, they might have arrested them. But they don't arrest them because they know that there's no point because of the color of the person's skin. That's what they were doing. That should infuriate every Minnesotan, black, white, in between. That is prima facie injustice. You're telling me, you want to talk about white privilege, you just described to me black privilege. As a black man, I have the privilege of going out in public and breaking the law in front of a cop. I can do that today, knowing that he likely won't arrest me because of the color of my skin. Holy moly. Wow. Tell me about your white privilege again, because I don't quite follow it. Yeah, I mean, and then again, context here. As I stated earlier, the stated strategic goal of the Democrat-administered Department of Corrections is zero warehousing. So for them, the objective is to get to the point where nobody is incarcerated. And so what this is, along with being, in my view, unconstitutional because it's unequal treatment explicitly on the basis of race, and extremely perverse from a public safety standpoint, because you're basically empowering certain races to be more criminal than others. On top of all of that, it is also a way to artificially decrease the overall prison population. Because it's not as though white people, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeremy, but I don't think you're going to go out and start committing crimes in order to make up the deficit of inmates who are not in prison as long, in order to balance the racial scales. So White people aren't going to go out and commit more crime. Black people are going to keep committing crime at the same rate that they already are, and they're just not going to be punished as much for it. So we'll balance out the scales in terms of what the aggregate numbers are in prison. And that's going to make Cedric Frazier happy. It's not going to make you safer. And it is going to make the Department of Corrections closer to their goal of zero warehousing, because their net incarcerated people will go down. Their net inmates will go down. But it's not going to increase the safety on the streets and the safety for your family.
Yeah. This whole conversation is about placing equity in justice and not equality under the law, which is what we have today. Justice is blind. When you take racial impact screenings and everything else and you apply it to the law, justice is no longer blind. Justice is now racist, whether you're for or against one a race or the other. And this is wrong. Government should not, we should not be having race written into so much legislation that passes the legislature. And it needs to be stripped out. We saw this in the federal level when they went to do, farm subsidies, and they realized there's an inequality of white to black farmers. And so they started giving loans to black farmers only. And that was challenged and eventually thrown out. It should, there's no tolerance for racism in our society. And if there is, we find it, root it out, and get rid of it. Everyone will accept that. But for putting specific racist legislation into law, that is wrong, and it's going to have a terrible effect on our society. This Frazier's bills are horrible, and I hope you can stop them and strip out race from the rest of them.
Well, no promises on being able to stop anything around here, but I certainly will make a stink about it, approaching Duane Quam levels if necessary.
All right. Well, Walter, I want to thank you again for spending an hour discussing legislation. You're going to be voting on some bills on Thursday this week. One of them is going to actually ban private prisons, if I read this correctly. This is a bill that Democrats have been pushing for. We don't have any private prisons today, but there is a private prison that's been shuttered out in western Minnesota that, if they decided to actually enforce law, they might need someday. And they want to just ban that altogether so that there's basically public housing for all criminals in the state of Minnesota. So thank you to listeners who've been tuning in for another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.